So, a bit of a reminder that TRCU is essentially a BMAT MBA. And the idea of the BMAT MBA is really an introduction, sort of scratch the surface of a whole bunch of MBA type concepts and subjects. It's not meant to be an exhaustive study. I think it's more a sort of intro that might remind you of your own studies or spark interest and read some more, or just something that you can go, oh yeah, that's about, and incorporate into your own thinking. Do you want to mute yourselves just for, so in case you forget you're not muted and start chatting in the background? Basically, what we're trying to do today is cram in the life work of about 7 leading psychologists. We're going to try and cram that into 45 minutes. So it's mostly going to be me talking. I'm going to sort of churn through 7 concepts. And if anyone wants to deep dive into any of those, we can do another session if you let me know, or if questions or discussing more detail at the end. But I aim to get finished by 8:30, so I know people have got meetings, that sort of thing. So before I dive into specific theories of motivation, I want to look briefly at what motivation is and what motivation isn't. So many people think of motivation as something that people do or do not have, and it's a sort of finite resource. People think, oh, this person has lots of motivation. They assume it is a personality trait. This person has motivation, this person doesn't have motivation. And all the studies that have been conducted over many, many decades show that isn't the case. Motivation is something that people show in specific circumstances. Everyone is able to show motivation in different circumstances. So someone who can't sit and read a textbook for 5 minutes, who can't be motivated to do that, can be very motivated to go and research alien abductions on YouTube till 4 in the morning, and it's very specific to what they're interested in. One day you may find yourself motivated by a particular task, on another day you may find yourself demotivated by them. Motivation is not a personality trait, it's a very sort of contextual thing. And the textbook definition of motivation is it's the processes that account for an individual's intensity, direction, and persistence of effort toward attaining a goal. So they define motivation as having 3 parts. One is intensity, which is how hard a person tries, and this is the part that we tend to focus on, but without the other 2, it is fairly meaningless. So someone may have intense motivation, but pointing in the wrong direction, we don't really see it. Direction is this where the intensity is pointed. Is it the right direction? Is it beneficial to us in the business? And often a person is highly motivated, but isn't motivated in the direction you want them to be. And then you also have persistence, and this is how long will directed intensity be maintained. So is this motivation a brief, fleeting thing, or is it something that's going to be sustained for a long period of time? And those are the 3 elements that the textbook defines motivation. So back in the 1950s, there was an explosion of study into motivation, and there was a whole bunch of studies done in the workforce. So this is back in the time of sort of the Ford Motor car company, the change in how factories work, the whole sort of revolution in how workforces were being run. And people were really interested in how some workforces were motivated, some weren't. And started to realise that a motivated workforce would be more profitable for the business, would produce more, would be happier, etc. So they really started to look at what makes people motivated, what stops people from being motivated. And from these studies, 3 sort of main theories came to the fore, and although those 3 are fairly dated now, when we go through in a minute, you think they sound very 1950s. They are sort of the basis and the foundation of most of the studies that came after them. So it's sort of, you need to study them to really understand where this concept of studying motivation comes from. So the first one is, so we're going to look at 3, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, theory X and theory Y, and Herzberg's 2-factor theory. And then we'll go on to discuss 4 contemporary, more modern theories of motivation, which is ERG theory, McClelland's theory of needs, cognitive evaluation theory, and equity theory. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this is pretty much famous motivation theory out there. It's one that gets quoted quite a lot. It's basically what Maslow found when he did his studies was that within every human being there exists a hierarchy of 5 needs. Basically that is psychological, so that includes hunger, thirst, shelter, sex, other basic bodily needs. The second layer is safety, it's in hierarchy is safety, and that includes security, protection from physical and emotional harm. Then you have social, which includes affection, belongingness, acceptance and friendship. Then you have esteem, which is internal esteem factors such as self-respect, autonomy and achievement, and external esteem factors such as status, recognition and attention. And then the sort of pointy end of the pyramid is the self-actualization, which is a drive to become what one is capable of becoming. So it includes growth, achieving your own potential, self-fulfillment. And what Maslow found or stated was that people exist in one layer of that at any given time, and when one is substantially satisfied, they move up to the next one, and that next one then becomes dominant. In terms of motivation, a substantially satisfied layer no longer motivates. So the main motivator is the current unsatisfied need. So humans move up that ladder in quite a rigid fashion, changing what motivates them depending on where they are on that pyramid. So for instance, someone who's hungry will be highly motivated, or someone who lives consistently with hunger rather than just hungry, is motivated by the prospect of getting food. They will be highly motivated to work, to do everything they can to get that food. And once that person moves beyond that, once they get regular food, hunger becomes a distant memory, they're no longer motivated by the need for food, and they move up to the next one, which is the desire, the need for safety. And that then becomes a primary motivator. And then when they feel safe, when that layer is satisfied, the next layer then becomes a dominant motivator. Maslow's theory is probably the best known of all, because it is what most good theories are, which is simple, it's intuitive, you can see it occurring. But unfortunately, although it is still, it's from the 50s, so 70 years later, it's still very well known. The data and studies that have followed haven't really backed it up. And studies have shown that although there are those needs, everyone does have those 5 needs, they don't necessarily act in a hierarchy, they don't necessarily react one at a time, and you don't necessarily move up them in that basis. So studies, so yes, some elements of it are substantiated, but the actual concept of the hierarchy isn't. So even though it has been kind of disproven for the last sort of 60 or so years, it's still one everyone knows. I mean, I've got a bunch of nerdy HR people. It's a meme that went around during COVID. I don't know if anyone else had nerdy HR friends who sent that meme round. And the basic need last year became toilet paper. So even, still a meme, even though it's been disproven 60 years ago. So that's the sort of enduring quality of that theory. So another theory that came out of the 1950s was by a guy called Douglas McGregor, who called it the theory X and theory Y theory of motivation. What McGregor did was he studied a lot of managers and observed they tended to sit in 2 camps in terms of their views on how people are motivated and how they view their workers. And this view then dictates how that manager interacts with and motivates that employee. And McGregor observed what he thought he calls theory X managers and theory Y managers. And theory X managers have 4 basic assumptions, which is that workers are motivated by money, workers are lazy and basically dislike work, workers are selfish, ignore the needs of the organisation, avoid responsibility and lack ambition. and workers need to be controlled and directed by management. So obviously nice, pleasant managers, these guys. On the other side, you've got theory Y, and these managers have 4 basic assumptions as well, and that is that workers may have many different needs which motivate them. Workers can enjoy work. If motivated, workers can organise themselves and take responsibility, and management should create a situation where workers can show creativity and apply their knowledge to the job. So you're very sort of regressive 1950s standing managers and very progressive managers. And in terms of motivation, theory X managers assume that those bottom couple of layers of Maslow's pyramid are dominant, that there's a need for safety, for basic things, is what drives people or motivates people. And theory Y managers tend to assume that the top 3 layers of Maslow's pyramid are what motivates people, that desire for self-actualization and self-development. But, so it's a nice theory. It says something very 1950s when you read it, but it is studies that have proven really it's a bit of an oversimplification, and most managers, most people will view people as a bit of a blend of those two rather than them sitting in 2 distinct camps. It becomes more contextual in that different managers think of different people different way. It's very mood-based, it's very situational based. So although this concept at the time was quite revolutionary, particularly the progressive management thinking, it hasn't stood up well to the test of time. But again, it's worth looking at because it forms the basis of many later theories and later studies. It's also interesting, I think we've all worked with managers who would be theory X managers, who really have this idea that it's very clear cut, people are lazy, people need to be almost pushed into working. And we've all worked for those managers who are completely opposite, think that people are motivated if you give them the right motivations. So not really a theory that holds up to the test of time, but a good foundation of future ones. The third and final one of these sort of traditional theories I want to look at today is what's called the Hertzberg's 2-factor theory, and it's also known as motivation hygiene theory. So Frederick Hertzberg was a psychologist, and he did a lot of studies on worker satisfaction and motivation, and he basically started a study to see what satisfied and what dissatisfied people, and he asked people to describe in detail what they felt good and bad about in their job, and he studied hundreds and hundreds of people. What he was expecting to find was a whole list of things that sat on this continuum between people being motivated at one end or satisfied at one end, and then the opposite end of this continuum being dissatisfied, and then being things that drove people up and down this single continuum. But what he found was quite very interesting in that the opposite of satisfaction is not dissatisfaction, and vice versa. What he found was there's actually 2 continuums, and the opposite of satisfaction is no satisfaction, and the opposite of dissatisfaction is no dissatisfaction. So it's rather than the top one that continuum he expected to find, he actually found at the bottom there's 2 continuums that drive people's motivation. And what he did is he then looked at what workplace attributes sit on as motivators and what workplace factors are hygiene factors. And he found that what he calls hygiene factors are things that people just see as just necessary. And a hygiene factor cannot cause satisfaction or motivation. A hygiene factor can only make people have dissatisfaction or no dissatisfaction. On the flip side, a motivator cannot make someone lack of motivator cannot give someone dissatisfaction. It can only give people satisfaction or no satisfaction. It kind of hurts my head going through all these. But the sort of hygiene factors are stuff like adequate pay, good policies, safe working conditions, that sort of stuff that is real sort of basic. The people view as just the basics of their role, hygiene factors. And so if you lack those things, people will become dissatisfied, but if you put more of them in, you can't make people more satisfied through more of those. On the flip side, you're motivators, which is things related to the work itself, such as self-development, promotions, outcomes derived directly from the work, like self-development, commission, personal growth, etc. And they are motivators. And more of those will cause more satisfaction, more motivation. But lack of those, at worst, will cause no satisfaction, but will not cause dissatisfaction in people. So, if you've ever given someone a pay rise and then wondered whether they're not highly motivated by that work, well, giving this person a 5k pay rise, why they're not working harder, why they're not more motivated. And what Hearstone found was because they don't see that as a motivator. That is, if they see that pay rise is just what they're owed, that's a hygiene factor, that you just reduce dissatisfaction, you haven't increased satisfaction. So really interesting concepts around how people view different motivators and these hygiene factors. So this is one of the three theories looking at. It's probably the one that's held up most over time. It does have a few detractors. The study itself, if you actually read it, there's quite a few flaws in how it was studied. But it's probably been the basis not only of motivation theory studies, but also in modern management thinking around motivating people by tying a self-development part of their role, focusing on that as the motivator. It's really the foundation of a lot of modern leadership concepts. So that's the three traditional ones. I'm going to charge straight into the more contemporary ones, of which I'm going to look at four. So the first one of these, so the traditional ones happened, and then over the years, the people have sort of looked into them further and evolved them. And ERG theory was really by a guy called Clayton Alderfer. He wanted to rework Maslow's hierarchy of needs because his concept is great, it just doesn't really hold up. So he did a lot of further studies into it. And from those studies, he found a revised hierarchy, which he grouped three groups of core needs, which is existence, relatedness, and growth, so hence ERG. Existence includes things that we need to live and exist, and they include things that Maslow classed as psychological and safety, such as food, housing, warmth. There's two layers of Maslow's hierarchy. ERG theory considers existence. Then you have relatedness, which is the desire to feel connected and maintain important relationships. So this includes the social needs from Maslow's model, as well as the extrinsic, so the outward-looking elements from Maslow's esteem level. So status, that kind of stuff. And then the growth group, which is the last of the three groups, consists of the inward-facing intrinsic need for personal development, that sort of inward-looking part of self-esteem, so self-respect, that kind of stuff, as well as all the stuff in Maslow's self-actualization layer as well. So whereas Maslow's model showed this rigid sort of step up these 5 layers, ERG theory says that they kind of all operate together. You can have more than one group operating at any given time. Some come to the fore in certain situations, others come to the fore in other situations. And they're all connected so that, if, for instance, what Alderfer found was a frustration at a higher level causes increase in desire at a lower level. So, for instance, if someone is looking for self-development, that is a motivator for them, but they're not getting it, then they're going to find themselves wanting and desiring more at a lower level, so more, for instance, financial input, more status, more, so that a lack of frustration for personal development may lead for need for more money or more status, that kind of stuff, and lower things. So, whereas Maslow said it happens in a rigid hierarchy, ERG theory revises that so that they work more sort of together and influence each other and happen simultaneously. So a bit of a rethink of Maslow's. There's also another theory by a guy called McClelland, He thought up the theory of needs. So here's a question for you. I have to shout it out, you just have to think in your head. So you have one ball to throw at targets, right? So in front of you there's 5 targets labelled A, B, C, D and E. So target A is within arm's reach. Everyone could hit it. If you hit it, you get $2. Target B is a bit further away. About 80% of people could hit it. It pays $4. Target C is further away still. It's challenging but doable. About 50% of people could hit it. If you hit it, it pays $8. Very few people can hit target D, but it pays $16. And target E is virtually impossible, but if you did happen to hit it, it pays $32. So given the fact you've got one ball to throw, which of those targets would you try and hit? So I'll keep that in your head a second. So according to McClelland's theory of needs, if you picked cup C, then you're likely to be a high achiever. Don't know if everyone picked cup C, but essentially the reason for this is that the theory states there are 3 types of need that drive people, and these needs that work. Everyone has these needs, but people have dominant type of thing that drives them. So you have a need for achievement. So this is the drive to excel, to achieve in relation to set standards, to strive to succeed. There's a need for power, which is a need to make others behave in a way that they wouldn't have behaved otherwise. And a need for affiliation, desire for friendly and close interpersonal relationships. So the first need, that need for achievement, is basically there are people that are driven by this need predominantly. If they're high achievers, they tend to differentiate themselves by having a desire to do well, to do better than expected. So they don't like wild gambles or things that rely on luck. They don't like things that are easy. They like to be challenged, and they like to do things that about 50-50 chance of success. That's a trait of people who are driven by a need for achievement. So if you, in that ball example, if you have target C, which pays about 50% chance, that tends to be indicative of a high achiever, because they don't want to take a wild gamble of the faraway balls. They're not interested in the easy win of the targets they're near. They want to go for something that's about 50-50 chance, something that challenges them, or something that uses skill. So seems a bit of an overly simplistic way of figuring it out, but that's apparently is quite a reliable study. And the second need is the need for power. So everyone has all 3 of these, but if this is dominant in someone, and someone tends to be motivated with a high need for power, to desire to influence people, and tend to love and be motivated by power and status orientated situations, and they love competition. That's what motivates them. So they can be more concerned with prestige and influence than performance, but if managed right, this can be a powerful motivator, that need for power, if you recognise that is a dominant trait in someone. And the third one is the need for affiliation. So people who have high need for affiliation are motivated by situations where there's cooperation rather than competition, where they get to strive for relationships and mutual understanding, and are motivated by this. So if you can tap in, if you figure out which of these are dominant need in someone in your team, and you can tap into that, then you're going to find more motivation. If you motivate using the wrong thing, then you're going to demotivate. So someone who is motivated by a desire for power, and you put them in a situation where you're trying to motivate them by building relationships and making everyone feel nice, warm, and fuzzy, they're not going to be motivated by it. On the flip side, if someone is motivated by a desire to create good outcomes for everyone, and you put them in a highly competitive situation, you're going to demotivate them as well. So, powerful study. It's really a lot of bearing on motivation, and worth sort of looking into your team and what motivates them, what's their predominant need. Probably one of my favourite ones is something called cognitive evaluation theory. So the main implication of cognitive evaluation theory is the way that people get paid in organisations. And as someone who spent a lot of years creating various compensation models, commission structures, I've worked with a lot of companies putting together compensation models that negotiate with them on all sorts of different, so all sorts of different ways of slicing and dicing paying people. And cognitive evaluation theory really looked at how people get paid and how they respond to that. And the official definition of the theory is when intrinsic rewards are used as payoffs for superior performance, the intrinsic rewards the worker gets from the superior performance is diminished. Which is quite a wordy way to put it, but basically what it says is that if you link someone's pay to doing something they love, then they will love doing it less. So, for instance, if somebody loves the sense of achievement they get from selling widgets, they like the feeling of hitting target, of getting a deal across the line, of selling as widgets, that's what drives them, they love it. If you then introduce a commission structure that's tied to them selling widgets, they will love selling widgets less than they did before. The motivation will then shift to being motivated by the money rather than being motivated by the love of doing it. So it's counterintuitive because we think if someone's doing well, we tie money to them doing more, you actually find that they will be generally less motivated than they were before. Or at the very least, the motivation will shift to money. So you then remove the money, the motivation will drop. So it's a really interesting study, and then there's still probably the one that's garnered the most research. And there's lots of research around different types of role. Does this work for roles that require creativity versus roles that are very repetitive? There's different theories on each of those. There's also a lot of studies around feedback. So there's different ways of paying people. And one of the really interesting studies that I read on this theory was that feedback is almost seen as payment. Workers desire positive feedback. But if done wrong, then positive feedback can actually become a demotivator. If you give positive feedback on someone's work, but there is a controlling element, then cognitive evaluation theory says that then demotivates them. So for instance, if you say to someone, great job, keep doing it, you've then tied that feedback to the job. You then reduce that intrinsic motivation they have for doing that job and replaced it with extrinsic motivation, which is your feedback. As compared to just saying to someone, great job, it just increases motivation. It's not tied to the work. And the reason they think this is it's a if you link something external to someone's work, then they experience a loss of control over that motivation. There's a shift in their perception of the causation of their enjoyment. So people start to think, okay, I'm enjoying doing this work because I'm being paid for it. I'm enjoying this work because I'm getting good feedback on it. As opposed to formerly, they would subconsciously be.
Simon, you've gone on mute.
I've got on mute. How long ago did I go on mute?
2 seconds before I
That
told
was,
it.
that was me.
I
was trying to pin you, Simon, but I pushed mute instead, so it's all me.
Right, okay, so I can't see. It's really weird. I can't see. I didn't know if anyone was there. It's really, I can't see anything. All right,
It's
cool.
totally my fault.
All right, okay. Thanks, Ollie. Okay, so yeah, so basically, I just last bit. So I'm not saying don't throw money at someone, don't give people pay rises, but if you give someone a pay rise and their motivation decreases, this could be why. And cognitive evaluation theory is really interesting theory to look into. and how you compensate people and how you tie that money to their performance really does impact their motivation. So the last one to look at is equity theory, which I find really interesting. So equity theory says that we all subconsciously continually make mental calculations based on the ratio between our inputs and our outcomes. So this is the amount of work we do, the results we get, versus the pay and rewards that we get in return. So we're constantly thinking about that ratio. But what we do, again subconsciously, is we then compare this ratio with the same ratio calculated for a reference group or a reference person, and then from there we decide if that is equitable. So if we find that it isn't equitable, then that impacts on motivation. So if we find that it is inequitable in our favour, i.e. we look at that ratio and go, oh, you know what, I do the same work as Dave, I get paid more, then you're more motivated. If you find it equitable, that you both pay the same for about the same results, then you go, okay, that's good. But if you find a dissonance between what you see your ratio as and another person's, then you're demotivated. Your motivation drops, and you subconsciously do this all the time. So, for instance, if you have, I'll give you a scenario. So John works hard, he gets good results. He's been with the company for a year and he gets paid 60k. He's just been given a £5,000 pay rise, so up to 65k, and he's happy. He's very motivated. He feels very, very well rewarded. Sue joins a company, and John finds out that she gets paid 68k. His motivation plummets. So that his situation hasn't changed, his work hasn't changed, his salary hasn't changed, but his motivation drops. And this is because the input that he sees from him, which is hard work, good results, loyalty, versus his outcome, that ratio is not equal to Sue, because she doesn't have those inputs. She's not been there before. She has experience, maybe more experience than him, but he doesn't see that as being a sufficient part of that bottom part of that equation, and her outcomes outweigh his. So he sees it as inequitable, and his motivation will drop significantly. Everyone does this all the time. It's a subconscious thing quite often. And what we look at is different comparison subjects. So people use different, from page here. So the different comparison people would use would be self-inside, which we can compare ourselves with ourselves within a different position within our current company. Self-outside, which we can compare ourselves with a situation or position we held in a different company. So we might say, oh, motivated because I get paid more for doing the same work I used to do in my old job. And then have other inside, which is we compare ourselves to another individual or group within our current organisation, which is a common one, or other outside, which again is another common one, which is where we compare ourselves to an individual group outside of our organisation that we see in a comparable role to ourselves. So people have different people to compare themselves to. Interestingly, men tend to compare themselves to men, women tend to compare themselves to women, and it's a whole nother subject. There's quite a lot of research around equity theory's impact on the gender pay gap, in that although we know there is a huge pay gap there, subconsciously people compare themselves to the people in their own gender, so there isn't that subconscious drive to isn't creating a dissonance that would otherwise push pays towards each other. So it's a whole bunch of research on how this impacts, not say it's the cause, but one of the factors in that gender pay gaps, the fact that for whatever reason it's still the same distance apart it was in the 70s, which is ridiculous. But so women tend to compare themselves to women, men tend to compare themselves to men. But we all compare ourselves to other people we see in comparable roles. When we find a inequity, we're motivated to fix it. And we fix that in a number of different ways. 6 main ways, to list them, 6 main ways in which we will strive to fix those inequities. One is we change the inputs. This is a common one. That is basically we stop working so hard. If we see that, if I see that Jeff's getting paid the same as me, but I think he's lazy, I'm going to do less work. He isn't, he works harder than me, but if that was the case, they change outcomes. So if, for instance, if you're on a commission-based role, you want to change the outcome, they might sell more. They might be motivated to sell more if they see that someone else is earning more than them for the same amount of input. They distort their self-perception. So, for instance, they might think, okay, look, I just work harder than everyone else. That's why that happens. I just need to work harder than everyone else, or I just tend to work harder than everyone else. That's just how I am. And they justify it in your head. And 4 is they distort perception of the other party. So they might say, oh, well, their role's easier than mine, or their role's not quite as desirable as mine. 5, they might choose another reference, e.g., they might think, okay, I don't earn as much as Sue, but you know what, I do better than Dave. So that's okay. So they might shift their comparison to another party just to make themselves feel that it's okay. Or 6, which is again quite a common one, is they see that inequity and they can't see a way of fixing it, is they will leave or basically mentally leave the role. So equity theory is a quite powerful motivation tool in understanding how people can become demotivated when you can't see what's changed. If someone was happy in their role and suddenly they're not happy, look around and say, well, what perception do they have around them? What information are they looking at? Who are they comparing themselves to? Because equity theory is largely about perception. It's worth noting that people see rewards, not just as pay. So this applies also in terms of feedback, accolades, rewards, shout outs and meetings. If someone perceives that they're working hard or as hard as other people, but other people are getting more recognition than them, then they will see inequity and they will find one of these 6 methods to rectify that, usually number 1, to be honest, which is that they don't work less, so become demotivated. So it becomes very complicated when you look at what do people see as reward. It's a mix of a blend of pay and recognition and rewards, and you mix it in with their perception of what other people get paid and how they get recognised and how they get rewarded, and then each person has different emphasis. Some people are very money orientated and just see that as a reward, and other people don't care about money, care about accolades. As a manager, knowing what things people see as rewards and how they're perceiving other people is a really powerful way of keeping people motivated. Okay, so that is basically it. They were just crammed about 180 years of research by some of the world's best psychologists into 40 minutes, I think. Okay, 8:30. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, there we go. Any thoughts for anyone?
I picked B.
Good job.
It was a toss-up though. In my head, I was like, oh, $4 or $8.
I nearly thought that the closest one, because it was only $2, so I could like do something else to make more money.
Can't even buy a coffee with that.
Take your $2 to the casino.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's quite a lot of information to cram in, but yeah.
It was awesome.
Good
Thank
though.
you.
All right, brilliant. All right, well, 8:30 on the dot. Look at that.
Thanks.
I'll stop recording, but I'll put the recording on. I'll send it out by email somehow. I'll put it online somewhere and send it out.
Excellent.
Thanks very much, Simon.
Thanks a million, Simon.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.